The early months of 1941 witnessed an unprecedented outbreak of strikes that was critical from the standpoint of the national defense program. A natural consequence was extensive, though uncoordinated and somewhat superficial, consideration by all agencies, particularly those most directly affected, of all the possible techniques that might be employed by the government if any of these situations should become a serious threat to the war effort. This study was given much impetus by the celebrated Alice Chalmers strike, which began in January 1941 and continued into April. The Minneapolis plant of this company was one of the key facilities in the defense program, and a halt in its production was potentially the most disastrous of the entire war period because of its impact on the destroyer program. The protracted inability of the Office of Production Management, or the National Defense Mediation Board, NDMB, to make any progress in effecting a settlement, resulted for the first time in serious consideration of a government seizure. Because the Navy had the primary interest and would serve as the seizing agency, and because a return to work occurred shortly after seizure began to be considered, the War Department did little active planning in connection with this case or against the possibility of some similar future contingency. The Labor Section in the Office of the Undersecretary of War, OUSW, however, he undertook research into War Department experiences in World War I and considered several general aspects of the problem. This study was stimulated by current events and the knowledge that the technique had been used with great success in the famous Smith & Wesson case. The scanty War Department files on World War II seizures were examined, together with articles in Legal and other. Bishop's reports on World War I plant seizures were historical and analytical, and they constituted an important influence on the subsequent development of the takeover technique and formed a basis for many parts of the plant seizure manual prepared 2 years later. Most of the studies, however, were not completed until mid-June 1941. After the war, the department had been plunged suddenly into its first case. The Civil War had seen the federal takeover, pursuant to special legislative authority of Northern railroads and telegraph lines. This action was undertaken because the seized systems were within a theater of operation and were needed for military use, and not because of labor difficulties or management failures. In World War I, there were 4 takeovers of this type, as well as simple requisitions for governmental use or convenience of the physical facilities of 2 other concerns. The most significant case was that of the Smith & Wesson Company, a small arms manufacturing concern located in Springfield, Massachusetts. It was the sole instance of a plant seizure resulting from labor difficulties. The employees struck after the company had discharged an entire workers' committee that had recently requested wage increases, and then successively dismissed various individuals who were believed to be union organizers. Because of the importance of the plant, the War Department endeavored to mediate the dispute, and upon failing to do so, referred the matter to the National War Labor Board, NWLB, which granted a portion of the employees' wage demands and directed the company to accept the principle of collective bargaining. The company informed Secretary of War Newton D. Baker that it would not recognize the decision. This caused a major crisis because the company's production was vital to the war effort, and because this was the first test case of situations involving management defiance of government labor policies. Moreover, it came at the same time as the first serious instance of labor defiance in the so-called Bridgeport case. Baker, acting under the provisions of Section 120 of the National Defense Act of 1916, placed a compulsory order on the company, directing it to manufacture forthwith the goods called for under contracts already in effect, but upon the condition that these contracts be performed under conditions as to labor prescribed by the United States Labor Board. The strength and legal validity of this order was reinforced by the presence in the War Department's contract of a provision that bound the company to accept the terms of any settlement of a labor dispute imposed by the Secretary of War. Upon the company's refusal to comply with the order, the War Department, acting under Section 120, took possession of the properties. The company acquiesced in and virtually invited such action, and the employees, upon seizure, promptly returned to work. The scope of the requisition is not clear, although it appears that the property seizures were limited to those assets deemed necessary to the actual operation of the facilities and did not include intangibles, such as bank accounts and securities. The method of operation was unique. Rather than undertaking operation of the plant itself or engage some outside company, the War Department turned management of the properties over to the National Operating Corporation. This was a company organized by the federal government under the laws of Delaware for the purpose of handling plants commandeered by the United States in those cases where a competent contractor could not be engaged on a satisfactory basis. All the directors were Army Ordnance officers. This corporation took Smith & Wesson's properties under a contract that provided that it would furnish the materials still undelivered on the basis of cost plus a $1 profit, while the corporation ostensibly operated as a private enterprise, entering into contracts with outside concerns and treating its employees as non-governmental workers. It was financed entirely with federal funds. The United States held title to all properties, and the corporation was subject by the specific terms of its contract to a high degree of control by the Chief of Ordnance over outside contracts for materials, methods of operation, costs, and wage increases. It was a dummy corporation in every sense of the word, a device adopted in lieu of direct government operation in order to free the employees from civil service restrictions and to avoid the complications of financing a direct government operation. The government successfully operated the plant until early 1919, when it was returned to the owners. The production rate had been slightly increased, although costs had also risen, primarily because the corporation placed in effect the wage increases directed by the NWLB, which the company had refused to accept. Following termination, there were lengthy hearings before the War Department Board of Appraisers on the company's claim against the government for reasonable compensation for the use and occupancy of its properties under the provisions of Section 120 of the National Defense Act. The company was awarded a sum of $673,225.28, as contrasted with its claim for $280,349.88. Despite the disparity in amounts, Smith & Wesson never appealed the award. The three other World War I seizures in which the War Department was involved were not the result of labor disputes. The Federal Enameling and Stamping Company of McKees Rocks Pennsylvania, was seized late in 1918 when the company, which manufactured booster casings, fuse sockets, and fuse socket holders, informed the Ordnance Department that due to insolvency it would close within days. Its properties were turned over to the National Operating Corporation following a short period of direct government operation, during which the general principles and practices followed in government arsenals were applied. The other two plants, the Liberty Ordnance Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and the Mosler Safe Company of Hamilton, Ohio, were commandeered because of the inability or unwillingness of the particular companies to produce vital war materials at reasonable prices. In both of these cases, a different approach was taken, and the properties were turned over to going concerns for operation rather than to the National Operating Corporation Liberty Ordnance, to the American Can Company, and Mosler Safe to the American Rolling Mill Company. The contract with American Can provided that the contractor receive reimbursement for costs, but no compensation for the performance of the contract. The United States was to furnish any capital required and to bear the entire cost, including a fixed sum per month for the contractor's general administrative and overhead expenses, in addition to those directly incurred in plant operation. In some respects, the operating contract resembles the kind of contract used in the case of government-owned, privately operated plants during World War II. The experience garnered from studying these cases led to several conclusions concerning the best techniques for seizing and operating properties, how to handle administrative procedures within the War Department, and the best manner of compensating owners for commandeered properties. It was assumed, although with certain reservations, that the government was empowered to seize properties during labor disputes that interfered with vital production. There were doubts, however, about the propriety of doing so under Section 120 of the National Defense Act, or under the comparable Section 9 of the Selective Training and Service Act. The assumption rested on the belief that the wartime constitutional powers of the President were sufficient. The study of the Smith & Wesson case indicated that great care should be taken to limit seizure to the property actually required to carry out the war production involved, so as to minimize the danger of unnecessary costs, stating no part of the plant should be seized which is not affected by the cause of the seizure, and which is not so inextricably associated with the property seized that it would be impossible to operate the two under different managements. The report suggested language for inclusion in any executive order to surmount any uncertainties as to what properties could and should be seized, while at the same time providing for considerable flexibility of action on the part of the Secretary of War. It emphasized the desirability of an inventory at the earliest possible moment and suggested a segregation of those properties to which absolute title was taken from those the United States took it for only temporary use. This would simplify the problem of computing reasonable compensation for use and occupancy at the termination of government possession. As to method of operation, Bishop outlined at least three basic types of approach. The first was direct operation by the government of the properties taken in the same manner as a federal arsenal. This procedure necessitated complicated bookkeeping and was aggravated by rules concerning the use of government funds imposed by Congress or the Comptroller General. It also required the substitution of civil service rules and regulations for the practices of private industry and any collective bargaining arrangements that might exist. These difficulties made this type of operation undesirable where other alternatives were available. A second method was that followed in the Liberty Ordnance Company and the Mosler Safe Company cases. This method, too, was objectionable. First, because the arrangement with the American Can Company did not work out in an entirely satisfactory fashion. Both the company and the government apparently expected the other to take proper steps for the preservation of the physical property of Liberty Ordnance, with the result that upon conclusion of manufacturing operations, neither did, and the plant went to rack and ruin at great expense to the United States. The second objection lay in the difficulty of finding a corporation willing to operate the properties of another company, particularly if the seized company was a competitor. This approach was particularly undesirable in cases where labor troubles were the cause of the seizure, because the managing corporation might be severely handicapped in any negotiations with employees at the seized properties by the necessity of keeping in mind the effect upon labor relations in its own operations. The third method was that adopted in the Smith & Wesson case, simply turning the properties over to a dummy corporation created for managing seized plants. This method had the advantages, like the second method, of removing the employees from the scope of civil service restrictions and of freeing the operating group from the problems associated with direct government operation. It also obviated some of the difficulties encountered under the second approach. This procedure was particularly useful in cases where labor difficulties were the cause of seizure. The report strongly urged that responsibility for any seizures be centralized in a section of the Office of the Under-Secretary of War to preclude the kind of red tape and serious confusion that resulted during World War I from division of responsibility and lack of intra-departmental cooperation. As the spring of 1941 went on, and as strikes continued to plague the defense program, greater attention was given in all quarters of government to the possibility of seizures as a remedy. Discovering a legal basis for such action received the most attention. The Attorney General studied the applicability of Section 9 of the Selective Training and Service Act and considered the issuance of regulations for use in case of labor disturbances. However, doubts arose as to the legal propriety of resting a seizure on this provision and about the constitutional powers of the President to requisition private plants in peacetime or even in time of war without legislative sanction. Because of the extraordinary nature of the remedy, it was deemed preferable to spell out the government's powers in a specific form. This led to proposals that special legislation be enacted and to the subsequent introduction in both houses of Congress of simple bills designed to vest specific authority in the President to take over a plant where a labor disturbance was interfering with vital production. Under the impetus of the North American aviation case, one of these bills passed the Senate and received strong support from the War Department, but not from the Roosevelt administration. At this time, federal executive agencies were giving more consideration to techniques other than seizures that might be employed to reduce the number of strikes. Many believed that some of the worst strikes were communist-inspired, and that if a procedure could be devised to deter communist activity in key plants, the situation would be greatly improved and the necessity for other drastic remedies removed. Many people thought, for example, that the Alice-Chalmers strike was staged by Mr. Christoffel, a local union leader, suspected of being a communist. That the serious stoppage at the Harville Die Casting Company in March and at the Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa, in Cleveland were the work of Mr. Chaffetz, another alleged communist, and that the North American aviation shutdown was of communist origin. There was enough evidence of this possibility to cause Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson to raise the matter in a cabinet meeting, and together with Secretary of the Navy W. Frank Knox to forward a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt recommending that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, look into the matter. A letter stated that strikes and deliberate slowdowns are having a markedly deterrent effect on our military and naval production, and that we are morally certain from a great variety of information reaching our departments that strikes and slowdowns are in many cases instigated by communists and other subversive elements acting in the interest of foreign enemies. President Roosevelt evidently shared these views, for he directed Attorney General Robert H. Jackson to increase the investigative responsibility of the FBI in the fields of subversive control of labor, and stated in a memorandum to Stimson and Knox that you are also correct in saying that strikes and slowdowns are in many cases instigated by communists and other subversive elements acting in the interest of foreign enemies. The Office of Production Management and the Cabinet both discussed the possibility of legislation, and John Lord O'Brien, OPM's General Counsel, prepared several drafts, amendments to the Sabotage Act intended to make it a felony to induce a slowdown or a strike for subversive purposes. Counter-proposals were drafted and considered in the War Department. Paralleling these efforts were attempts by Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, in conjunction with other high government officials, including Stimson, to develop anti-strike legislation applicable to cases pending before the NDMB. Secretary Perkins first suggested an amendment to the Criminal Code, making it a felony for any individual to advocate a strike, while the NDMB had jurisdiction. She later became convinced that such a procedure was unworkable and drafted another bill deemed enforceable, giving the NDMB the power to order employees to refrain from striking and employers from changing the status quo for a period of 30 days. For a short time, a real possibility existed that some form of legislation might be proposed by the administration or pushed by Congress as a partial cure for serious labor difficulties. Although strikes continued at a high level, both of the above suggestions were abandoned, undoubtedly because of the effectiveness of the North American aviation takeover. Any further consideration of legislation to deal with allegedly subversive elements in labor disputes was also affected by the Soviet Union's entry into the war on 22 June 1941 and the concomitant change in the Communist Party line, and by the results of informal conferences between government officials and top labor representatives, particularly a conference between then Solicitor General Francis Biddle and Congress of Industrial Organizations President Philip Murray in late June. Most of the proposals, including those of Perkins, was pigeonholed until the next serious crisis.